I can only really comfortably sit in a room if there's a lock on the door. It's something that no one wants to say with confidence, but that's what was going on.
So I usually use the term intergenerational trauma, and that's simply when the effects of trauma on one generation is passed on to subsequent generations. So, for example, children learn unhealthy or maladaptive ways of coping with stress. For example, their parent may not have learned effective ways of coping with their own trauma. So they may cope with stress or trauma by yelling, by using substances, by hitting the child, or even by abusing the child the way they were abused. And so that child does not learn how to manage their negative feelings. They may copy their parents' maladaptive coping strategies. So you see those patterns being repeated down through generations.
Three years ago, I was diagnosed with PTSD. Part of it responsible was the situation my brother brought upon all of us with his presence and actions. They tried to put him in therapy, tried to give him behavioral help as a kid, but nothing ultimately changed, and he still chose to act the way he did. My parents are Lutheran. Religion played a part in my mom not wanting to cut out my brother. It started with my mother, about her own mother. The way she treated my mother as a child was absolutely atrocious, and because of the many things she did, that led to my mom cutting contact with her, and with that, it sort of embedded this fear of cutting out members of the family that are blood related. It was a drain on all of us, but also I wanted to be around because the possible fear of what would happen while I'm away. He didn't bully mom as much when dad or I were around. I realized I was struggling with the situation in our home since I was a teenager. My parents' response to my diagnosis was without many consequences for him. Things kept happening. It was a revolving door, talking to my parents when he wasn't present in the room, but ultimately there wasn't much action until he was evicted. When it comes to trying to heal from everything that happened, growing up in this environment, it affected my growth in the way I trust people.
I grew up in I would say Mexican culture, Hispanic culture, Hispanic community. It's kind of a norm to not really talk about mental health in the family, but slowly, since my mom was a more sensitive of a person, I realized that she has been more sensitive with me about talking about those topics. My mom has been diagnosed with depression, so if I were to ask her questions about mental health and ask her for help in any like emotional sense, she would be there for me because she's been through the same things too. I've got separated from my family when I was like 8 years old, and my siblings as well, and I moved in with my grandma. I didn't know how to process that, and I don't think I did process that until I was about like 13, 12, like once puberty hit and stuff. And I moved to a different middle school, or to a different school, like not knowing anyone, and I kind of felt alone in a way. And it was a different community too. People had money. I wasn't used to that, and people just had different lifestyles than I did. So after school, I would go home and just take really long naps and write about like how I felt sad, but I wouldn't think it was anything else. And so eventually I got older and kind of reflected onto during that time and realized like maybe I was really going through it. I feel like what helped me get out of that was I just didn't want to feel like that anymore. I just didn't want to be in that state anymore. I tried really hard to allow that to happen and make that happen, and also gain a little bit more confidence in myself and allowing myself to feel those positive thoughts and let those positive thoughts guide me.
Children who have any of those kinds of difficulties, having negative thoughts about them, negative beliefs about themselves, the child themselves, other people, perhaps blaming themselves, physical headaches, stomach aches, and so forth, asking for help and telling somebody that you're suffering or you're having difficulty, whether that's your pediatrician, your teacher, a faith leader, or a parent or some older adult that you trust, because as you're talking about, especially for generational trauma, your parent or your caregiver has also experienced the effects of trauma and is your biggest potential source of support. So you don't want to have to go it alone. You want to include that parent or caregiver, unless they're the person who abused you, in which case you want to include it. Another caregiver who, can support you. Again, the second part of that is learning resiliency skills, such as how to relax your body, how to recognize negative feelings and cope with those, how to recognize negative thoughts and change those, and then learning to talk about and making meaning of the experiences that you've had rather than pushing them away. That's really important. Sharing those experiences with your caregiver or your parent, and then learning how to be safe going forward. It doesn't have to take a long time. Most of these treatments don't take years and years. They only take, 3 or 4 months for kids to get significantly better, and they can live healthy, happy lives going forward. There's no need to suffer, and most importantly, there's no need for generational trauma to continue into future generations.
I think it's hard to know exactly how far these traumas stem back in families. For me, I can see it going as far back as my grandparents' generation. In fact, on both my mum and my dad's side, grandparents greatly affected by the trauma and loss experienced in both world wars. The one that seemed to be the unintentional scapegoat, perhaps, but carrying so much of this trauma was my mum. Well, she got the diagnoses, several diagnoses from a very young age, the main one being bipolar disorder, but lots of other things, and her behaviours were incredibly unstable and self-harming. It was very much the medical model that was followed in terms of pathologising my mum's behaviours. So it was never seen as a trauma, it was never seen as a story carried through in the family, but something that was fundamentally wrong with my mum. I was born into trauma. A mum who wasn't present physically. She was spending most of her time on a psychiatric ward. There was something more to this that I didn't know, that I had to run away from almost. I had to run away psychologically from my mum's behaviours as I was growing up to survive. I was then subsequently brought up by my dad and my stepmum after my parents divorced. And that was a difficult family home. I needed to disassociate from what was going on around me, and I couldn't make sense of it, and I didn't have a way to explain it. When I got to university and I got into my first serious relationship, which was lovely to begin with, but sadly it broke down, and it was at that point that I think I relived the loss of my mum that was unresolved. Even though she was living, it was still a huge loss around that maternal figure who couldn't have been there for me. Now, alongside all this, I had this absolute visceral sense that I was not going to go down a psychiatric route. I'd seen the trauma and the way that my mum had been treated by that. So I did go to therapy sporadically on and off from the age of around 18. which healed to a certain extent. These things can put a plaster on it so you can keep going for a while. I didn't go deep. I needed to sort of keep going, get my life going, establish my career. I met my husband, and actually so much of this healing ultimately is in relationships, if not all of it. So finding a support network, finding some stability. This really hit home though when I became a mum, and therefore it had a huge impact on the way I mothered, which in many ways I wanted to make sure I parented in a way that my parents hadn't. I wanted to be present, I wanted to be stable, and I pushed myself to do that. And in some ways I think this is sometimes the problem when you've come from a trauma background. The pendulum of parenting swings the other way, and I became the opposite. With all this sort of stuff going on in my unconscious around trauma and the physical day-to-day of parenting, it was way too much for me, and I became very exhausted, and it eventually led to me being signed off work with effectively what would be diagnosed as postnatal depression. I mean, eventually I went into therapy. I did it slowly, somehow, because I still needed to be there for my kids. I changed careers and got into counselling, and really began to understand and make sense of how the medical model pathologizes trauma, and there is another narrative. There are ways of healing. It takes time. For me, it was a challenge. I think in my parenting, I couldn't always be there psychologically. I would become overwhelmed if my children were upset, and it made my daughter quite anxious, and that anxiety eventually played out into more extreme mental health problems. But we named it, we owned it, I took responsibility, and we went through the work together. Family therapy was very, very helpful, and we were able to make sense of what was going on for us, and why this wound was here, and why we were carrying it, and why it mattered. Because I think this is what trauma isn't it? It's a wound that goes unhealed or unsupported. And self-care is the truth of this, the acceptance and self-care, and through my poetry, through writing stories, and that's the hope I hope to carry on.
The main message I want young people to know is that through your courage and your willingness to face your traumas rather than to run away from them, you can transform your trauma experiences, and you can change the course of your family's future.